joining Shoes in Bitcoin.
Hi there, it's great to be with you.
Thank you once again. So today we are going to talk about your project. You have already developed, created some slides and some information that you would like to share. So I suggest we just go ahead.
Yeah, well, I know you usually do video chats with somebody in person, and I'm a little protective of my identity, so I figured we'd just walk through a slideshow, and I could tell you a little bit about the project and what it does, and maybe where it's headed.
Great, thank you. Don't worry about being pseudonymous, so everybody is really appreciating and understanding uh, the importance of privacy. So it's definitely not a problem. Thanks once again for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the opposite of privacy, now I'm going to dox myself and tell you a little bit about my background.
Okay,
um, I've been kind of following Bitcoin for about 7 or 8 years now. I was previously a police officer, kind of a local police officer, but early on in my career, um, after a few years of doing the normal police officer stuff of answering calls and making traffic stops, I had the opportunity to join a digital forensic working group, and so I jumped at that. And for most of my career in law enforcement, I was in a computer lab every day, taking apart computers and phones and imaging hard drives and trying to find evidence that either proved that someone was or was not involved in crimes that uh, were being investigated. Beyond that, I got into 3D printing a few years ago, and that's another thing I tinker with is 3D design and just trying to design usable things. Um, and beyond that, I'm a stay-at-home dad, and that's a big part of my life. So SeedSigner is something I try to balance with those those tasks.
right. So great. It sounds impressive that you have used to occupy such kind of a position, which is connected with what's of digital detective job, I suppose, and you must have for sure the right skill set, having also in mind that you've developed that what we are going to talk about today. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll talk more about kind of how my background in forensics gives me a unique perspective. But just first to jump into like how did I hear about Bitcoin, because it's kind of a fun story. It was actually at work when I was a digital forensic examiner. There was another examiner at the lab who was working on a case where a local kid had been selling drugs. I think it was just marijuana at school, and he got caught by the teachers and the police. And as they were figuring out where he had gotten the marijuana to sell at school, they found out that he was mining Bitcoin at home with a computer that he'd gotten. It was either for his birthday or Christmas or something. He'd gotten one of these more expensive computers with a more advanced GPU or a graphics card. And at that time, back in 2012 and 2013, you could mine Bitcoin reasonably profitably at home with a GPU. It was kind of just when ASICs were starting to come onto the scene, and they weren't very widely available yet. So this kid was mining Bitcoin at home, and then he would go onto this website that I hadn't heard of prior to that called the Silk Road, and he would order drugs, paying with Bitcoin on the Silk Road, and then he'd have them shipped in the mail to his home. After which he'd break them into smaller packages and take them to school. Not the most legal thing to do, but it was pretty enterprising on his part, and it got me wondering about what is this Bitcoin thing that he's using a video card to get Bitcoin, and I just started wondering about how does all this work? Like, why would people around the world be donating that much computer resource to to something like this? It didn't make sense. So I started reading about it. At first, I thought maybe it was like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or if you've heard of folding at home, or maybe it was some sort of huge global password cracking engine. Uh, but as I first read about it, it didn't make sense. And with a lot of people, you have to encounter Bitcoin, more than once before you dig into it. So a few months later, I don't remember particularly uh, what got me back interested in it back, but I started reading and understood more about proof of work, and down the rabbit hole I went. And I mined, at home early when ASICs were just coming available. Uh, had a couple of miners and a bunch of GPUs and mined a bunch of useless altcoins in my basement, and thankfully didn't burn down my house with all the electricity we were pulling. But yeah, so
It sounds very interesting, the fact that, for example, the majority of people in your situation, when they've experienced for the first time Bitcoin in not a very positive way, like these kids that you have mentioned about, they tend to reject it immediately without digging more into the technology, just because of the experience. In that case, a kid who was buying drugs and buying via Bitcoin those drugs, and
right.
he was, yeah. So you were curious about it. uh, and so you have kept looking into it, and did you have any, I would say, uh, technological issues to understand it? You've mentioned that you didn't, yeah, it did not make sense to you in the beginning.
Yeah, no,
So
it didn't, and luckily that's partly with forensics is with whatever case you're working on. When you're working in digital forensics, we see such a wide variety of cases that involve, Windows operating systems, Apple computers, Linux operating systems, phones that are running Android, phones that are running iOS, and then all the different file systems and file servers you can run into. We could be investigating something that's on a computer in a residence, or we could be trying to pull apart a server that's in a business. So um, as a forensic examiner, you really have to be versed in a lot of different areas of technology, from file systems to operating systems to how data is physically stored on media. There's just a lot of, so I have a diverse technological background just by virtue of you have to be comfortable enough with the technology to be able to go into a courtroom and explain in front of a judge and a jury, and uh, prosecutors and defense attorneys how the technology works. So I had a little bit of a varied background, so some of it made sense, but I don't want to overstate the amount of learning I had to do. Bitcoin involves so many domains of expertise. I actually have a bachelor's degree in English and a minor in philosophy, and I'd like to think that being able to think about game theory and the history of money and politics and so many different things factor into putting all the pieces together to understand Bitcoin. That's a little bit off into the weeds, but yeah.
definitely. So it's a huge pleasure to have such person with so much experience. Thank you again for joining. Please go ahead with your story.
Yeah, so did some early mining, but as mining became more focused on the cost of electricity, it wasn't practical to do it out of my house. Still really into the ideology of Bitcoin. I tend to lean on the libertarian side. But back in 2017, as the price was going up and the fork wars were happening, I have to admit it, like I had weak hands, and we were at the point where the amount of Bitcoin that I owned enabled myself and my wife to get out of debt entirely. So most people have a mortgage on their house, and the Bitcoin had appreciated to the point that we didn't carry a lot of debt otherwise, but we'd be able to buy our house and live entirely debt free, which opened up more options for me to stay at home with the kids and be more of a homemaker. And I always kind of told myself in the back of my mind that if it grew to the point that we were able to transition to a debt free life, I would consider that. And this is just as the fork wars are happening and Bitcoin Cash is splitting into its own chain. And admittedly, I had weak hands and just kind of sold everything all at once. Um,
Right.
kind
So,
of kind of put Bitcoin down for 9 months as I saw the price go up. It wasn't super healthy to watch it go higher and higher. Um,
imagine.
and then after the market peaked and it started to come back down, I started, I kind of find my
Relax.
way. Yeah, I found my way back into listening to Bitcoin podcasts about the technology and the ideology and like the picture I have on the screen, it pulled me right back in, and I started following it as closely as I ever had before. So about a year and a half ago, I was super blessed to be able to leave my career in law enforcement and digital forensics and be at home to focus on the kids and stuff. But I'm this kind of person who always likes to keep busy with side projects. I love to tinker with technology, so um, that kind of led me back into Bitcoin and into this project.
That's great.
So I already kind of glossed on this, but in the digital forensics round, I always used to joke with people that I worked with in digital forensics because it can be stressful because you kind of think of it as adversarial computing, and that whenever you're making decisions about how to acquire evidence from a device or the conclusions that you can or can't draw from a particular piece of evidence, you always have to be thinking a few steps ahead rather, to how can I defend my decisions in front of a jury, or if I'm being asked difficult questions about why I decided to interpret an artifact in a certain way or to acquire evidence from a hard drive or a phone in a certain way. So digital forensics itself kind of introduces you to this adversarial kind of thinking, where it's the same when you're trying to secure a private key. You need to think a few steps ahead in terms of, how is the storage of this key going to affect who might have access to it, or how am I signing transactions, and is the process you're using to do that maybe exposing private information, or when you're generating a key. So it just back to that sort of whole concept of adversarial thinking. We also, at the forensic lab I worked with, operated an entire offline network where we stored evidentiary data, and that kind of just introduced me to the concept of, in theory, keeping a network offline, so any updates you introduce to it are pulled from separate storage media, and then, in theory, your network never touches the internet, just as an absolute security protocol. And lastly, a lot of people maybe aren't aware of it, but when people who do uh, digital forensics practitioners, when we work on a mobile phone that we're trying to acquire data off of, there are kind of very strict requirements to the kind of state you want that phone in when you're trying to pull data off of it. And one of the most important things is, if you're at all able to isolate that phone from the larger cellular network or any sort of Wi-Fi network or even Bluetooth connectivity. So at in my prior work, we had what's called a Faraday enclosure, which we were fortunate to have. It's actually a small room about the size of a closet with a thick metal door and metal shielding behind the walls and the floor and the ceiling, such that when you go into that room and you close the door, if you're looking at a phone that had been previously on the network, the bars quickly dial down and all of a sudden it's searching for a signal. So that way, when you're pulling data off of the phone, you're not getting new data in that might not be covered under your authorization for your search. And there's always the chance a lot of people who do bad things are technologically savvy, and if they know their phone's been seized by law enforcement, if their phone talks to the internet, they might use some sort of remote wiping, which is legitimate technology in case you lost your phone. You wouldn't want people to have your information, but understandably, criminals might use this to. So we try as hard as we can to get those phones off of the network, which is also an important protocol to what I'm building with SeedSigner, in terms of making sure that the device that you're uh, entering your private keys into, or that you're using to help generate your private keys, it's not that it won't talk to the internet, it's just that it flatly can't talk to the internet. It can't talk uh, to other devices via Bluetooth.
Okay, so is this something, sorry if the question is stupid, is this something that is specifically like a trend for your projects and with SeedSigner? Or this is something everybody like Ledger, Trezor, and the other producers
It's
such gadgets
it's
are?
right. It's a little bit different security model that's starting to gain some steam. I can't speak too definitively about where the wallet space is going to be headed, but I'm not the only project doing this. I actually first encountered this model when I was exposed to Spectre's DIY device, which also uses air gapped QR signing. But there's some other projects out there that are exploring the same model, and that I don't think Trezor and Ledger and other wallet makers may not entirely switch to this model, but I think as people learn more about this model of air gap signing, which I think keeps your keys like a little bit more definitively secure, I think maybe they'll offer some additional products that appeal to people who are trying to use this type of signing device.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So as I was just kind of touching on where did the idea come from, as I was getting back into podcasts, and I'm kind of a podcast junkie. Stefan Livera is one of the podcasts I listen to regularly, and he was interviewing a gentleman called Michael Flaxman who had written this 10x Bitcoin security guide, which is a super comprehensive um, piece of research on best practices when you're generating private keys and setting up a multi-signature wallet and that sort of thing. So on this particular podcast, they discussed Spectre, which is a wallet software that I honestly to that point hadn't heard of and wasn't familiar with. So it's freely available, and I jumped on it and downloaded Spectre for my system and started looking at the software. And as you start to look at their GitHub page, I discovered this Spectre DIY project, which was DIY as a do-it-yourself kind of wallet. So I bought the components for that because it looked compelling. And the first time that I set up a DIY and used it in a multi-signature setup with Spectre, it was I'd call it an epiphany to me, in that it was as exciting to me as the first time I'd done a Bitcoin transaction or the first time I'd used the Lightning Network. It was just this aha moment where you kind of smile to yourself and it just makes sense. Like it it's intuitive and it just makes so much sense. So I, of course, started moving in the direction of setting up my own, long-term multi-sig, because I'd been wanting to do a multi-sig wallet for a long time, and prior to that, I had kind of a proxy for a multi-signature setup, but it was using a, a website that's still out there. It's called bitaddress.org. It's probably not as widely used as it used to be, but with this bitaddress.org, you could set up kind of the functional equivalent of a multi-signature wallet, but it was using something called Shamir's secret sharing. So you would split a private key up into multiple parts, and much like you do with a multi-sig wallet, you could split the parts of the private key in different geographic locations or a safe deposit box or something like that. That sounds like it's something that you're familiar with.
Valerio Vaccaro, during our last conversation and webinar episode, he was exactly explaining about Shamir and the additional security, the additional decentralization of your, if I can say, security, and the way you can divide and make several passwords, and the combination is one. But also this is kind of, it's a very big responsibility. You have to be very careful and
Right.
pay lots of attention.
And one of the things that Michael Flaxman talked about in his setup was how multi-sig setups are a little bit more forgiving in terms of if you lose one of your private keys, as long as you still have the public keys and have records of those, like you can either screw up one of your signers or lose the private key altogether, and as long as your setup kind of is built on a solid foundation, it gives you a little leeway in terms of room for errors.
Right. So we have
So
to be careful. Mm.
right. So anyhow, I'd previously been using this bitaddress.org model with Shamir's secret sharing, and I've been wanting to migrate to a multi-sig setup, and the solutions were just coming online with Caravan and some of the other products, but I was really taken by Spectre and went back down the rabbit hole with it. At that same time, the same gentleman, Michael Flaxman, who had also been using Spectre DIY, uh, tweeted out that he was looking for a case or an enclosure for it. And me being the kind of person who tinkered around with 3D printing and some other enclosure projects in the past, I kind of threw something together, and him and I started exchanging a few DMs about that, as well as some of the other things that he discussed in his security guide. So he had talked about at that time how he thought it would be neat to um, have a Raspberry Pi Zero, which is a very small version of Raspberry Pi's computer, and to use a specific version that didn't have any wireless capability to generate or to help generate a seed phrase. So you've probably talked this over in some of your previous sessions about how you'd randomly pick words and yeah,
Right.
but you need to be able to calculate the last word
Yeah.
essentially based on the first either 11 or the first 23 words. So he talked about how it'd be neat to do that calculation on a tiny computer that was verifiably not connected to the internet and never would connect to the internet, because there's a website called Seed Picker, and it does a great job of calculating that final word. But with my background, you get nervous when you put your computer into airplane mode, because what if somehow your words end up in your browser cache, or there's some sort of uh, keylogger on your computer that you don't know about, or somehow you start to think about the many ways in which the words that you're entering into your computer could somehow be compromised by someone who's trying to obtain them. Does that make sense?
Yep. Aside from the part that actually you are isolating it from the wireless, it will never have connectivity to the network, and simultaneously, it is capable to calculate and provide you with any suggestions for the phrase.
Right. You want to be sure that you're doing this on a computer that is never going to talk to the internet, and in fact, even if you wanted it to, it couldn't talk to the internet. So it's just
Oh,
an additional kind of
right.
level of being sure.
Security. Yeah, being sure.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
So based on like kind of exchanging some instant messages with him, I bought one of those Raspberry Pi Zeros, and I bought a little display control set, and I started experimenting with it, and I started brushing up on Python. I'd taken some coding previously in college, but I wasn't anywhere near a functional Python programmer, so I enrolled in a Udemy course and started watching videos on just basic Python programming, and I started to try to just take tiny baby steps with the programming and with starting to integrate the hardware components. So just the simple thing of, can I display letters or even a test picture on this little screen that attaches to the tiny Raspberry Pi computer, or can I get it to display letters of the alphabet and use the controls to cycle through the letters of the alphabet, and just kind of baby steps. And can I integrate that into the official BIP list of seed words? And I slowly kind of built um, some code where I was able to replicate calculating the last word of a 24 word seed phrase. And then I put together kind of a rudimentary setup where you can, if you're willing to roll dice 99 times, you can take the entropy from the dice and use that to generate a full 24 word seed phrase. And I, after I gotten those things done, I started to get curious about the Spectre DIY project and how that works with the integrated, scanner and the QR codes. And I started to wonder, what if I attached a camera to this little computer? Would it be possible to turn it from just something that helps you generate seeds into more of a full kind of signing device? So I started going back to proof of concepts and seeing, can I attach a camera to it and get it to reliably scan a QR code and input the data from that? And can I take my own data and load that into a QR code that I then display onto the screen of the little computer? And it just went back into the kind of experimental phase of what's possible with some pretty inexpensive components and, for me, a basic knowledge of coding. I'm not any sort of advanced coder. I just kind of keep banging my head against the wall until I can get it to work.
I see. And you were mentioning that it's the the parts that you need, not
Hmm.
only hardware, but everything is very cheap. So does it mean in order to do it myself, I have to order all these parts?
At this point, yes. At this
Okay,
point, and I'll get into that more in a couple of
okay,
slides. But at this point, SeedSigner is a build-it-yourself project. I have
okay.
to I have to admit that there are only so many people out there that are going to build their own stuff. So at some point, if the software continues to mature and improve, I think it makes sense for me or somebody else to offer these as an assembled device. But right now, while we're still kind of testing the software and confirming out in the wild that it's working as it should, yeah, it's a build your own kind of tool right
It's
now.
great. And you mean at the end it can be like a kit that can be ordered and you can just do it with specific instructions at home. Do you
Right,
think
right.
I will be able to do it, for example?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. The probably the biggest headache right now is soldering. So the Raspberry Pi Zero, when you purchase them, I don't think I have a picture in the slide, but if you're familiar with a Raspberry Pi,
Yes, I know how it looks like. As my partner in life, he's also playing with with such hardware, and he's also having his projects. So I'm full with raspberries.
so he's got his junk laying around like I do probably.
Right, something similar, right? Yeah.
So on the Raspberry Pi 2, 3, and 4s that you've probably seen, they have those pins that stick up that allow you to connect either a cable or another
Yep.
device to it.
Yep. Hmm.
So that the tiny Raspberry Pi Zeros in most places don't come with those pins already attached.
And you
So
have
the
to order from another place. Hmm.
Right, so you have to order the pins separately and then attach them yourself, either with a soldering iron, which is a little bit, it's something anybody can do, but it's a little more advanced. Or they have some rigs where you can buy the pins that are constructed a little differently, and with a hammer you can tap them in so they work the same.
Okay. So
Those are
this
some.
is the only tricky part, which is nothing connected with the technology or the hardware itself, but it's more just we need more glue, a specific glue.
Right, special kind of glue.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
beyond that, so once you get the pins attached, it's really just attaching ribbon cables for the camera and connecting the screen. It's just a matter of assembling some simple components. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So back to kind of the big picture, SeedSigner. What does it do? It creates this air gapped environment that we've been talking about. So it it's not that it won't talk to the internet or you've disabled it from talking to the internet. It's that it doesn't have the hardware to talk to the internet, and that is super valuable for when you're putting in seed words and you're trying to generate a private key through randomly picked seed words. It also, I have here, enforces the separation between the private keys. So with the Spectre DIY kind of model of signing, you have um, your seed stored on a piece of paper, or maybe you've etched it into some metal or something like that, and you have software that is coordinating your multi-signature setup. And the DIY, or in this case a seed signer, is something in the middle that enforces kind of a layer of separation between your seed and the wallet software that is designed, of course, to talk to the Bitcoin protocol and talk to the internet. So it enforces a kind of separation between those two. But this third one, I think, is probably just as important as the other one, the other two, in that SeedSigner kind of lowers the barrier cost. That was one of the things I was curious to do uh, with the Spectre as kind of Spectre DIY as a jumping off point was when most people set up a multi-sig wallet. Best practice, ultimate best practice, is that maybe you mix an open source device and you mix up some different manufacturers. So you might use a Ledger, you might use a Trezor or a Cold Card or any of the other manufacturers. And the idea is if one of those has some sort of security compromise to it,
Right.
um, you, that only affects one of your signers in your multi-sig setup. However, you know, a lot of people in the world don't have three, four, $500 to spend on several different hardware wallets, but they still want to be able to have a multi-signature set up and have access to that security model. So what the seed signer does, or what we're trying to, you know, get it to do, is to drive that cost down dramatically. So to get a full signing device together, you can obtain the components and assemble it for, well under $50. And you can use that same device for each of the cosigners in a multi-sig setup. So you might have your private key stored on, like I said, a piece of paper or etched into metal, but you might keep one at a safe in a trusted relative's house. You might keep another at a bank in a safe deposit box. You might keep, another hidden in your own house, wherever you decide it makes sense. But you can use each of those keys with just one device. And so you can have a two of three, a three of five, or whatever kind of multi signature setup you want with just the one device that costs less than $50. So I'd like to think that opens it up to uh, a whole wider subset of people who want to have the security of multi-sig, but maybe can't or just don't want to spend several $100s on, a bunch of different hardware wallets.
And if something happens to the device itself, so you cannot unlock the funds.
No, if something were to happen, let's say you did use a Spectre DIY or a Seed Signer
Mm-hmm.
to set up a multi-signature wallet and you
Yep.
lost it or it broke or for whatever reason you lost access to it,
Yep.
you could just build another one and off you go. It there
Okay.
and the device itself is not designed to remember your private key. So when you enter your private key through the controls, after you use it to either set up a wallet or sign a transaction, when you disconnect power from it, it's not designed to remember your private key or your seed phrase. So
Okay.
um, you could use another device that works the same way, and it doesn't matter having the specific device that you use to set up the wallet.
Okay. So because you have mentioned that these keys actually can work only on this specific device, and this is where my question was generated from. But yeah, you have made that elaboration. So as long as the device itself has this additional functionality or security, it's possible to use the keys on it or to replicate the wallet if I
Right.
understood properly.
Yeah, and if I can be explaining it clearer, please, ask
No,
ask me, and I'll try to do it again.
it's most probably again because of my English capabilities and understanding. Not always I'm able to get everything, but this is something I think I got it. So you can just create a new wallet, and you can extract the funds as long as you have all the private keys the
Right,
same
and
way.
it's not even a matter of recreating the wallet. Like if you were to lose your device or for whatever reason it were to get damaged or didn't work anymore, you could use the same wallet you had just with a new device that would operate in the same way.
Right.
Um,
No,
yeah,
normally I don't. I mean, that what I know is I can basically, as long as I have my phrase and my private keys, I can open my funds from each and every wallet, which is designed for it. So,
Right. And it's kind of similar to if you had a Trezor and for whatever reason that had become compromised or broken. As long as you had your seed words, you could get a new Trezor and enter those seed words into it, and it would, everything should work the same as it did before losing it.
okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. So this kind of air gap signing model that I'm doing my best to try to explain here, it's something that it really helps to see in action. But what it does, as I kind of mentioned before, it breaks what you think of as a wallet into three different pieces. And that's the private key storage, which is your seed written down somewhere, the signing device that's used to communicate between the private key, and the third kind of separation, which is the protocol software, which in the case that we're talking about is Spectre Desktop. So Spectre Desktop is designed to communicate with your Bitcoin node and talk to the rest of the network. But how this model works is such that um, the signing device never communicates the private key to the protocol software. It just proves that it knows the private key and is able to sign a transaction or sign a message with the private key without actually sharing the private key.
And
And
this is important that it's
right,
not doing it because,
because you never have to worry with your model about the private key leaving that device.
okay,
Um, and this is, in my mind, as a paranoid forensic practitioner, but I have a Trezor and a Ledger too. And when you connect that device to your laptop to be able to, log in and move some funds or access your account, it's connected with a USB cable. And my mind starts wondering, like, what if my computer's compromised? What if when I uploaded new firmware, what if that included some sort of malware? And there are all sorts of protections against this, but it's the point of enforcing that air gap is such that it drastically reduces the amount of ways that your private key could become leaked or compromised.
okay, okay, got it. So,
So air
so it,
gaps,
it is always disconnected and it can never be connected. This is why actually not to transmit the private keys.
right?
Okay, okay.
And so it uses a model, and we'll talk more about this, which is a partially signed Bitcoin transaction, where information about a transaction is communicated from your wallet software to the signing device, and then the signing device digests that and uses the private key to prove that it knows the correct private key to unlock the funds, and then not the private key, but the signed transaction is communicated. Just the signed transaction is communicated back to your wallet software. So the
So,
private key stays private, and just the signed transaction goes back to the wallet software.
and this is enough for the system and the blockchain to verify it. I mean, I don't know from the other side, but as long as it's working.
Right,
So,
right. So
okay.
the wallet software understands that the correct private key is being used, and that's what unlocks the fund. It's a little bit different model from the conventional, sending transactions with Bitcoin Core or something similar like that.
So you mean that the other wallets that are mostly usable these days from the people, they don't have this additional future, I would say, privacy and security
Now,
related
I
feature.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds into talking about the
Oh,
security models that the other
okay,
wallets use because I haven't studied those at great degree.
okay.
It's just my perception of when I'm signing a transaction with QR codes, there's only a very limited amount of data that's um, being transmitted to the signing device and then back to the wallet software, and you don't have that kind of lingering question of the device that's connected with a USB cable for a few minutes or an hour or however long, you just don't wonder about like what's going over that wire, what could be going over that wire kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sure. So the air gap signing, in the case of SeedSigner, it uses QR codes to communicate the unsigned transaction into the signing device and then the signed transaction back to the wallet. But it also, there are a number of devices like ColdCard has air gap transactions. I know that use, I think, a micro SD card to where you move the micro SD card back and forth. And that's kind of another version of air gap signing that allows the files on the SD card to move the signatures back and forth instead of QR codes. But you could also use something like infrared light. I don't know that there are any um, wallets actively using that right now, but it just to give you an idea of what an air gap is, it's just significantly limiting the amount of information that's going back and forth.
Right.
And I think this next slide probably will go into that. Like this, why is air gap even important? And it's not a perfect analog, but I kind of think about what if you are at war and you have a prisoner from the other side, and this prisoner has secret information that is vital to your side, like they know where you're storing weapons, or they know a launch code for a missile or something like that. Somehow this person has obtained this information, and you know you have to keep them separated from their side until the conflict's over. And it's this idea of if you had a prisoner with secret information, would you allow them visitors that they could sit and talk with in kind of unsupervised conversation? No, you wouldn't do that if they had secrets that were important, not to get out there. Or you wouldn't even let them talk on the phone, because as soon as that information gets out there, the damage has already been done. And that's kind of like a private key. Like as soon as once your private key has been leaked, like there's no going back from that. You only have kind of that one chance to secure it from it being communicated to other parties. I mean, once a private key has been burned, you should never use that again. So if for whatever humanitarian reasons you want to let them have contact with the outside world, maybe you would let them write letters and send letters, but you wouldn't just take those letters and let them go in and out of the prison where you were keeping them without first looking at the letters and trying to make sure there wasn't important information or secret messages. This is going down the rabbit hole a little bit, but it's kind of that idea of when you're using QR codes to communicate between the wallet software and the signing device. First of all, with QR codes, there's only a limited amount of information that can be sent because a QR code can only contain so much data. And the other aspect of it is there's a high degree of auditability in terms of if you have any concerns about what the QR code is relating, it's super easy to decode that with another device and make sure that there's no sort of suspicious data being sent or received from the signing device. It's a way to control the flow of information and to verify that there's nothing nefarious going on back and forth. Does that kind of resonate with you? I'm
Yeah,
still kind of figuring the best ways to explain this stuff to people who aren't as familiar with it.
definitely. I think I've grasped the main idea. And I can say that their gap is a cool and nice to have thing.
Right, right. I'm glad I've kind of sold it that way. So it's kind of the how the didn't they when Google first started, they said don't be evil. Well, with air gapped, it kind of switches it to can't be evil because there's just no way for the device to
Right.
be
Even if you
leaking.
want,
Right, right. Okay.
you can't. Okay, thank you.
So this to kind of jump back to what you were asking about with the different components, this hopefully clears some of that up. Um, the first picture, which has the little green circuit board with the ribbon cable connected to it, the larger green circuit board is actually a Raspberry Pi Zero. In that picture, it doesn't have those pins that I was talking about before attached to it yet. But
For
this
the
picture,
plugin.
right? but it does have the ribbon cable that shows how you attach a camera to that. And the second, the smaller green circuit board in that is actually a camera module that allows it to take in camera data, which in the case of the SeedSigner, it doesn't take pictures. It uses it to scan QR codes.
Right, so
Um,
not for selfies, not
right, not for selfies.
okay.
Uh, and then the other two pictures that you see, well, the picture over to the right of the Raspberry Pi Zero that has almost like a little video game controller with the three buttons and kind of a what is a joystick
On the
control.
left side, yeah, I saw.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
I know.
that it,
I've seen this. I've touched this with my hands.
yeah. So that's how you interact with the device. That's how you navigate through the menus, and that's how you see the different letters that you're entering your seed phrase. So these three basic components together are what make up the SeedSigner. The Raspberry Pi Zero is kind of very specific screen with controllers, and then a more basic Raspberry Pi compatible camera. And then kind of the fourth thing that you don't absolutely have to have, but that I've also been working on is an enclosure that kind of holds everything together and you don't have to worry about the components getting damaged accidentally or anything like that.
It's like a cover. I was wondering what is this orange peel because I was looking at your tweets and now I understand. So this is the cover. So that makes your wallet fancy in the orange color, in the right orange color.
Right. Yeah, it was you kind of when you have the Raspberry Pi Zero and the screen and stuff, it's kind of this awkward little stack of components. And I was trying to turn lemons into lemonade and make it something that would resonate with Bitcoiners and that they'd recognize and think was kind of a cool idea. So the idea of the orange pill, what if the seed signer was in the shape of an orange pill?
Yeah, it's great. I think especially if later we have this as a kit and all the components. It's a nice idea.
Right, either as a do-it-yourself kit or
Yeah.
something that's already pre-built. Um, so just at a basic level, in case I have been clear about this, what does SeedSigner do? It number one helps you calculate a full seed phrase by taking in the first 11 words or the first 23 words that you have created, and then it'll calculate that needed 12th word or the 24 words so that it's a correct seed phrase that will fully pass like checksum verification. The second thing it'll do is if you have some dice and you want to sit down and roll dice 99 times, you can enter the dice rolls into SeedSigner and it'll generate a full 24 word seed phrase from that. Um, the third thing is it will allow you to take a seed phrase and input XPubs or extended public keys into Spectre. Um, so you will type your 12 or 24 word seed words into SeedSigner, and it'll generate in QR codes the extended public key that you use to create a multi-signature setup. And then the last thing is once you have a multi-signature setup with Spectre, you can use it to sign transactions with one or more different private keys. And that's accomplished with Spectre will display a transaction in QR codes, and you use the camera to read the QR codes into SeedSigner, and then after you verified the transaction and signed it, QR codes will display on the screen of the SeedSigner, and you can hold the screen signer up to your laptop, and Spectre will read the QR frames in, and once it's read in all the QR codes, it will interpret the transaction as having been signed and ready to send off to the blockchain.
Right. Okay. And what is PSBT?
I'm sorry, that's partially signed Bitcoin transactions, and that's
Partially. Okay.
yeah, it. So if you have a multi-signature setup,
Yeah, I got it now.
you're only going to be able to deal with one signer at a time. So it's a way of communicating a transaction that isn't totally ready to send off, to multiple different devices.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And quick side note, it's not a current feature, and it may never be a feature to generate entropy using SeedSigner, like some of the hardware wallets. There are hardware wallets that will let you either roll dice or pretty much with any wallet you can enter your own seed phrase. Now, the way a lot of people use hardware wallets is when you first turn them on, they run a little bit of code that creates what should be a random seed phrase, and then they communicate that seed phrase on the screen. You write it down, and that's your wallet backup. But best security practices would mean that you generate your own entropy, meaning that you generate your own randomness. And the way most people do it is you randomly pick out of, a large list of the acceptable seed words, and then use a program like Seed Picker or a Seed Signer to calculate the checksum word. But the question I'm trying to get at is, why is it so important to bring your own entropy, either when you're using Seed Signer or, frankly, if you're using some other hardware wallet? And that's because there are a couple different attacks that are theoretical, but still kind of important to be aware of. And one of those is what some people refer to as a retirement attack. So let's say at a wallet manufacturer, there was a malicious employee who had snuck some code into the seed generation module that others didn't recognize or didn't notice as being not random, meaning the person who put the malicious code in there would be able to kind of predict how seeds were being generated. And if they can predict how seeds are being generated, they can recreate that. So they call it a retirement attack, meaning they put this hidden vulnerability in the software. And then when they're ready to leave the company, they exploit the vulnerability and they can steal a lot of money that way. Meanwhile, the whole time, people never even knew this vulnerability was there.
Right. I'm one of
So,
those people. Yeah.
yeah, so somebody, this is a way of getting around that retirement attack by generating your own entropy. But I should also point out, like, um, the random vulnerabilities in the kind of randomness or random number generation, they may not be intentional. It could just be that later on, better researchers come forward and realize that the way that the randomness was being generated, whether it's through like a system clock or some sort of other means, wasn't totally random, and that could give people who are looking to exploit like an attack. It could give an attacker a way to maybe, with some degree of likelihood, generate private keys, and they might have to generate a lot of private keys. But if they can somehow exploit a weakness in the randomness, it could allow people's private keys to be generated. So bringing your own entropy, so picking your own seed words or rolling dice, or there are other ways too, but bringing your own entropy in a way that no one else in the world can replicate is going to go a long way in ensuring that your private keys can't be reproduced by someone else because of some sort of unknown vulnerability in the software.
Definitely. So you have mentioned that there are predefined lists with words that you can use. Who has created that list? Is my
I
question.
I can follow up on this. I think it's BIP 39, but I might have the BIP number wrong. But there's actually the Bitcoin improvement proposals that specify how seed phrases can be stored have a preset list of over 2,000 words that are acceptable words. And if people listening to this or watch this go to just Google seed picker, there's actually a link to the BIP proposal and the authorized words. And they have a kind of a unique way that they do it, where you print out a list of the words, and then you do a combination of rolling dice and picking names out of a hat um, to kind of generate your own randomness. But that's something I could add to this presentation, and that's something we'll have to put out there.
Yeah, Valerio has also covered this topic, but I think
Okay.
it was a good idea to mention it here also about these words, because the people who are working this for the first time most probably will be asking this question.
And in
So
terms of the deep technical details, I'm sure he's a much better person to go through that stuff.
I cannot assess anything. Okay. So it's very important. So people who are willing to increase the level of their security, to play with some dices, to use some, to dedicate more time on creating their own
Right, and
own own
it's a great exercise to learn more about how the software works and how Bitcoin as a protocol works and private keys and such. So, for people who are wanting to go deeper or who are exceptionally paranoid about security, yeah, it's a good tool.
Okay, thank you.
So that's basically what SeedSigner does. It's still definitely a work in progress, and there are some things I'm looking at adding down the road. Probably the biggest pain point right now is because my code is running on top of the Raspberry Pi operating system. When you apply power to it and turn it on, you're basically waiting for a whole little computer to start up. So you
Slow.
it's slow. So
Yeah.
when you first plug it in, it's about a minute and a half, which is painful before you get from I plugged it into the menu's up. Now once the menu up is up, it's very responsive and it works, quickly in the way it should, but it's just getting the whole operating system to boot up underneath it takes some time. And that's kind of my next development task is migrating from that kind of stock Raspberry Pi platform to a more streamlined Linux platform that just has the modules that it needs to be able to work. So hopefully we can get it to the point where it boots up a lot faster.
The penguins going always to Unix.
Yeah, those penguins are not moving as quickly on on the SeedSigner first.
It's
Um,
okay.
but there are a couple other things. Uh, there have been some security conversations lately about, and this is another one of those obscure kind of security vulnerabilities, but there were some questions sort of put forth about what if these extended public keys that people use to create a multi-signature wallet, what if there was some malicious code in those? How do you verify that the extended public key that you're adding to your multi-sig software really represents the private key that you're controlling? So we could build into SeedSigner a way to hopefully audit other tools such that you enter your seed phrase and it shows you the derivation path and the parent fingerprint and the public key string, and you can use it as a way of secondarily verifying what your other wallets are doing. That's going to depend whether or not there's really that much interest in it. But right now, there was a lot of talk on Twitter about what if your extended public key is compromised, and what are some ways that you can verify that with maybe a secondary software tool.
It's
Um,
possible to verify whether they've been compromised.
right. It's I maybe not if they've been compromised, but maybe it's better stated that there you can verify that you have the correct public key in your multi-sig software.
Okay, it can be why it can be the wrong one.
Right. So the way this attack would work is, what if, regardless of the seed phrase that you enter into your wallet, the wallet gives you a public key that you add to your multi-sig software, but the public key is actually not represented by your private key, it's represented by a private key that an attacker would control. So it wouldn't necessarily compromise your whole multi-sig wallet, but if this attack was being executed, then that one particular signer would kind of uh, be hijacked by the attacker. And if they had hijacked, one or enough signers, they could withhold funds um, through that attack vector. It's with security research, a lot of this stuff is obscure, and 99% of people out there are never going to see it. But it's just kind of identifying those edge cases and trying to nail down the security as tight as possible for the high value kind of situations.
Prevention.
Right, absolutely. Um, so anyhow, some other directions right now. Seed Signer only works with Spectre, and it only works with multi-signature setups. It wouldn't be too difficult to uh, add settings to it to make it work with single key signing, but it's just not something that's in the software right now. Um, Another kind of integration that I'm actually the most excited about right now is being able to attach a small offline printer to the SeedSigner, because one of the more onerous things right now is, like with any sort of sign device, entering your words one by one is kind of tedious kind of task, like one by one typing your words in. And so it's perfectly reasonable if you have a long-term wallet that you're using to hold Bitcoin, and only every once in a while you're going to put together a multi-signature transaction and maybe spend some of the funds. But for a wallet that you were using for more everyday use, it's kind of a pain to type your seed words in every time you want to be able to do a transaction.
Right.
Um,
And the
Being
thermal printer?
with a thermal printer, what I'd envision doing was, once you had entered your seed phrase into SeedSigner, you could print out a piece of paper that would have both a QR code that represented your seed phrase, as well as just your seed phrases um, uh, written out, in words and letters. And then you'd be able to maybe put that with each of your storage locations for your private keys. But what you'd also be able to do is, with the camera, you could scan the QR code and it would just import your entire seed phrase all at
Ah,
once,
yeah,
and you wouldn't have to go through the process of entering the words letter by letter, one by one.
right. So it's facilitating, it's user friendly for inserting your private keys in the wallet itself, not to type it every time.
Right, right.
And okay, but it's also a little bit, additionally, you're complicating your life. I mean, but
Could be, yeah.
could be also that. But if you really insist on having a very strong security on Bitcoin and your funds, you are going to do it. So,
Right, right. It's just kind of everybody's comfort level with the
yeah,
value that they're securing. Yeah, for sure.
right. Okay,
Um, so I probably should add more pictures of the device throughout the presentation, but what we've been talking about this whole time is the picture there at the bottom with kind of the menu screen
great.
displayed. Yeah.
And basically, if someone tomorrow is watching this webinar and would like to create, to do it by himself, herself at home, so are there any instructions on GitHub? Is everything?
Yeah. Most of the instructions are on GitHub. So if you just Google GitHub and SeedSigner, it should take you to where the project is hosted. Um, Another super useful resource is we have a Telegram group that has some other people that have assembled them and are using them and are kind of interested in the project too. So there have been people who have been building them and have had questions about components or soldering or some of the different steps, and people in there are super helpful because they've kind of already done it.
Great. Thank you very much, SeedSigner, for this valuable conversation. I have learned really lots of new things. I will need to watch this once again to assimilate the information. Most probably, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd also thanks so much for having me. If people have any interest in following the project on Twitter, I'm just at SeedSigner, and there's actually some useful videos that I've tweeted in the past that you can see that will kind of help people understand who haven't seen this security model before. It'll make a lot more sense just kind of seeing someone step through the steps of signing a transaction with QR codes and sending a wallet up and such. But again, thanks so much for having me on your show to talk about SeedSigner and hang out for a little bit.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.